Okay. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this, the final one in our Jewish Renaissance events of the term. I'm really delighted to be hosting tonight because I want to introduce you to someone who is a good friend, a fantastic Jewish educator, but also an incredibly talented artist whom we think of so highly at Jewish Renaissance. We have just appointed her to be the creative director of our Jewish emerging artists or artist development scheme that you'll be hearing a lot more about in January. So I'm really pleased that Jacqueline is now a good part, a serious part of our Jewish Renaissance team. And I'm even more excited that she's going to be teaching tonight about Judith, the story of Judith and Holofernes, which has been one that has long puzzled me, both as the story itself, but that it's been linked to the festival of Hanukkah. So I can't wait for her to unravel the story for us and to talk to us about the art that has been created around the story by both Jewish and non-Jewish artists. But before we do so, I really want to just introduce Jacqueline properly because she deserves that. She is an artist who works with Jewish texts and heritage, and uses often traditional rabbinic texts as a starting point for her fine art practice. So she forms relationships between the printed texts, handwriting, and of course, drawing. She has a huge amount of emotional potency in her work, I think, as well as a really beautiful aesthetic. And I don't use the word beautiful lightly. She originally trained as an architect and then she went on to study to be a medical illustrator. So she learned anatomy and precise observational drawing, but she says got distracted by fine art. I think she understood that all these things fused into fine art. And she took an MA in fine art from Central St. Martin's. She's exhibited her artwork in London, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, New York, San Francisco, Venice, Warsaw, and Krakow. And her recent residences include Bet Venezia and the Centre for Jewish Studies at Manchester University. We've showcased her work a couple of times in the magazine, including the project she did for Bet Venezia. So I'm always happy to showcase Jacqueline's own work, but it's a real delight tonight to invite her to talk about the story of Judith. So Jacqueline, over to you and welcome.
You. Thank you. That's such a warm introduction. Thank you very much. And I'm going to admit a couple of things. I am not going to be showing you any of my own artwork tonight. I am showing you lots of other people's artwork of interpretations of Judith and Holofernes, but I'm not showing any of mine. And we put in the blurb that there's going to be some drawing exercises. And for those of you who are very familiar and feel very comfortable in drawing, I hope this isn't going to be too basic or frustrating for you, but they are just like little exercises just to kind of how to process the images we show. And for those of you who are not so used to drawing as a way of thinking, I just invite you just to doodle or play with it. And it's not about creating a drawing to create something like you would stick on your wall, but it's very much drawing as a way of thinking. And hopefully you kind of will go with the process. And if you don't want to do that and just look at the pictures, that's fine. This is one of the beauty of doing things online. You don't have to show or share anything you don't want to. So that I'll get that bit out of the way. So first of all, I'm very excited to be presenting this particular class about the story of Judith and the story of Hanukkah and how Judith became a Hanukkah heroine. And it's a rather strange story. It's not particularly linear, and actually it's quite mysterious. And in my research about it, it kind of the questions just got bigger in terms of, well, and I had never really sat and properly learnt the book of Judith as I did in preparation for this class. And the more I learnt of it, and the more I delved into it, the more it's like, well, why isn't this book, the book of Judith, in the canon, in the Hebrew Bible, in our Tanakh. Why is that not there? And the book of Esther is. And in some ways, it's quite strange. Like the book of Esther doesn't have the name of God. The book of Judith, God's all over it. In Esther, in the Megillah Esther, in the book of Esther, you don't see Esther praying. In the book of Judith, Judith prays to God a lot. You don't have also Esther. It's kind of a bit murky what she's doing with Ahasuerus's palace. But with Judith going into Holofernes, it's a big bit in the text. Like she's not going to eat or drink of his food and his wine. And we see her like, so she's very committed as a religious woman. So in some ways, like it's a bit odd that's the kind of first question is why isn't that? But I'm going to share my screen now and hopefully this will, sorry, let me just, I'm going to share my screen with you and I do apologize. Let me just, should have set this up properly. Gosh, after all this time of Zoom, still learning the basics with it. There we go. There we go. So this question of like, why, but she is associated as Hanukkah and she is associated very much with our text. And so my first slide I'm going to show you tonight this is a Hanukkah. It's in the New York Jewish Museum collection. It comes from the 19th century in Italy. And here we see this female figure, quite scantily clad, a little bit of a cheeky breast flopping out there. She's holding in one hand a sword, and in another hand, if you look closely, she's holding a head. You can see a face there. And underneath her are these two lions, and then there's sort of these flowers, these other decorations. And this is a Hanukkah. So this is used for Hanukkah. And it's like, well, here we have this story of Judith there on a Hanukkah. Now, there's lots of there's a Hanukkah in the shape of a dinosaur that I saw recently. So, like, well, we aren't dinosaurs in the story of Judith, but it's like, but there is a connection here. What is this connection? We see this connection coming to the story of Hanukkah, this festival that starts on the 25th of Kislev. And we learned stories about it I remember the stories going to Cheder of the story, like the story of Hanukkah is about the miracle of the oil that lasted 8 nights when it should have only lasted a night because they could only after the Greeks were defeated they wanted to light pure oil in the temple and they only had so the miracle was the miracle that the oil lasted 8 nights. And then when you kind of realize, well, actually there was also a military victory going on that is also there, and they've got the military victory of the Hasmoneans over the Greeks at that time that they managed this oppressive, huge empire that were oppressing the people, and the Hellenism and Greek culture coming in and influencing and leading people astray. And so this kind of religious battle between Hellenistic culture and Jewish culture, and then it gets really murky because you realize actually the Hellenists that they're fighting were probably Jewish as well. And so there was this a war between like the Judeans and the other, or was it a fight actually within the nation? So the Hanukkah story is gets a bit murkier. And then we have in the prayers that we have Al Hanissim, about the prayer like about the miracles that is introduced in the grace after meals, and it's introduced in the prayers for Hanukkah, but also for the festival of Purim. And these two festivals, Hanukkah and Purim, are often kind of seen as together as the unit because they're rabbinic festivals. The rabbis kind of established that these should be celebrated as opposed to the kind of they have a slightly different status and to the other festivals like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Sukkot. So they have a slightly different status in that. But you have this festival of Hanukkah and you have this story of Judith, and how did the two come together? Well, in the rabbinic literature, in the legal literature, in the coming from the Talmud, before I say that, so the Talmud which is kind of the oral law, or the development of rabbinic Judaism and the writing down of the oral law, there is no separate section of the Talmud specifically for Hanukkah. We have Masechet Megillah, which discusses a lot about Purim. We have a section of the Talmud for all the other festivals, like Sukkot and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, etc. They each have their own section of the Talmud. But for Hanukkah, there is no Masechet Hanukkah. The laws of Hanukkah, though, do appear in the Talmud, and they appear in they kind of sneak in other places. And one of the main places they come in is in Shabbat. So when the Talmud is discussing the laws of Shabbat and specifically lighting candles, because you can't light a candle when the Sabbath comes in, you can't make a fire then. So you've got to make sure that your homes are full of light beforehand. So it's very important that you light your candles with oil that is going to burn cleanly and for a long time and of a nice smell, so like olive oil. So you have a lot of those laws about the candles that you need to light for the Sabbath. And since we're talking about lighting candles, they also start discussing about lighting the Hanukkah candles. So Hanukkah in the rabbinic literature and the legal literature sneaks in. And it sneaks in little places, but it doesn't have its own book. It doesn't have its own section of the Talmud on that. And we're going to see here. So this is from the first text on this slide is from the Talmud that is discussing about Shabbat, and it says Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says that women are obligated in lighting the Hanukkah lights, as they too were included in the miracle of being saved from the decree of persecution. Now, you could be asking, well, why do we say, well, women also are obligated in lighting the Hanukkah candles? And it's kind of because there's this understanding that women aren't obligated in time-bound commandments, in positive time-bound commandments. The women generally aren't obligated. So why would they be obligated to light Hanukkah candles? And then the answer is, well, they were also saved. So if they were also saved, then they should also kind of be part of the redemption celebrations and the ritual of that. So that's that. But that's a kind of curious phrase of they were also included in this miracle. So we're kind of looking for Judith. We haven't found Judith yet in connection with Hanukkah, but we found that women were included in the miracle. So we have Rashi, who is this kind of early French commentator on the Talmud, whose commentary is printed on the same as the Talmud page. So it's often kind of like the first port of call to the commentary on the Talmud. And he looks at that. They too were included in the miracle. And he expands that, and he says, for the Greeks decreed that all Jewish virgins who were engaged to have sex first with the high Greek official. So that's part of the oppression but that's all the women, all these Jewish virgins had to kind of, before they kind of had probably, they had to have sex with a high Greek official. That was part of their persecution. And then he goes on to say, and a miracle happened through a woman, full stop. And you kind of go, oh, okay, who's this woman that this miracle happened? And then we have the Tosfot. Tosfot is a kind of 2 generations down from Rashi, who's often printed on the other side of the page. And that's not actually in Sabbath, it's from a different part of the Talmud, but it's taken this phrase since they were same part of the miracle. And Rashbam, which is one of these collection of commentaries 2 generations from Rashi, explained that the primary part of the miracle was done by them. And this is the Talmud here is discussing not just Hanukkah, but it's also discussing Purim and Hanukkah and Pesach, and why women are obligated in all of the commandments to do with all of these festivals. So it says, well, the woman that is associated with Purim, and why women in general now need to be obligated in celebrating that's by Esther. So we know that. We know Queen Esther, she's the heroine of the Purim story. Hanukkah by Judith. So here we are, we found her. And Pesach, because they were saved by the merit of the righteous women of that generation. And actually the story in this particular piece of Talmud is about the women in Egypt And the whole of that generation of women who were enslaved, the Talmud at that point is discussing that they would go into the wilderness and give birth in secret instead, because they didn't want to risk that their baby boys would be killed under Pharaoh's decree. So actually, it was the entire generation of mothers that they are sort of set. That's how the people were redeemed. So that's Pesach, and that's a whole other story. It's fascinating. But here we have Judith. Judith gets named, and it's by Judith that we have Hanukkah. And it comes in this kind of medieval kind of commentary on the Talmud that we have this like Judith and Hanukkah link. And we also see it in the legal writings, a much later legal writing. This is Shulchan Aruch. And it says on the 25th of Kislev, the 8 days of Hanukkah, those 8 days, you are not allowed to eulogize and fast, but you can do work. So it's not like a Yom Tov, so which is like the laws of the Sabbath. You can go and do work during those days of Hanukkah. But women have made it a custom not to work while the candles are burning. And there is an opinion that we may not be lenient for them. So actually there was a practice that women, while the candles are burning, don't do any of the kind of creative work that you're not allowed to do on the Sabbath. So that was a minhag that was happening. That was a custom that was happening there, but with this women. And then there's a commentary, the Ramah, which is part of, it's all integrated now into the Shulchan Aruch, says that some say that cheese should be eaten during Hanukkah. There's a custom to eat cheese during Hanukkah because a miracle was done through milk, which Judith fed the enemy. And so this is the Ramah saying, so here we have, so what's this miracle that Judith feeds the enemy? And that's part of our Hanukkah story. And it's quoting and it's summarizing this, and it's bringing these other, and so this is the Kol Bo, which is a 13th or 14th century Jewish legal text. And actually it gives a really nice summary of how Judith is a Hanukkah story. So it says, women are obligated to light Hanukkah candles, for they too were included in the miracle. So that's what it says in the Talmud. This means that the enemies came to destroy everyone, men, women, and children. And there are those that say that the great miracle occurred through a woman. We saw that with the Tosfot. Who is this woman? Her name was Judith, and she was the daughter of Yochanan, the high priest. She was extremely beautiful, and the Greek king wanted to let her to lay with him. She fed him a dish of cheese to make him thirsty, so that he would drink a great deal and become drunk and recline and fall asleep. And it happened just that way. And once he was asleep, she took his sword and cut off his head. She brought his head to Jerusalem, and when the armies saw their leader had been killed, they fled. For this reason, we have the custom of eating a cheese dish on Hanukkah. So this text is doing a lot in terms of this summary, and we're going to kind of maybe look at this after we've actually learned in the book of Judith the text and kind of go, oh, that was an interesting thing they did there. But here we have this very nice summary of the story of Judith and Hanukkah. So it's a Greek king. She's the daughter of the high priest. She feeds him cheese, so he drinks lots of wine and becomes drunk. And she takes his head and sticks it in Jerusalem, and that's a sign. And they all fall. So one of the interesting things I think is going on with this story is that you've got the kind of publicizing of what she's doing by hanging this head up, which kind of reminds me a bit of the we put the Hanukkah candles are supposed to be by the doorpost because there's an element of publicizing the miracle. So there's this very public hanging of the head, which is going on here. She's bringing it to Jerusalem. And the other thing which is staying is that the armies just ran away. They just fled. They just disappeared. And it's this sort of downplaying a little bit of like, actually, there was a great big battle. There was a military victory that went on, and probably a lot of people were killed. But the way it's summed up here in this halakhic guide is like, that's sort of downplayed. And what it is it's like, this is the miracle, the great miracle is this act of a woman. And it reminds me of a kind of what the rabbis were doing with, like, well, the great miracle is the fact that the oil lasted for 8 days. And it's like, well, there was a military victory as well, but that gets really pushed down a lot because actually there's a lot of discomfort with the military, with what happens in the Hanukkah story, not just because of the kind of the fighting, the Hasmoneans, but rather what happens next. And that is that the Hasmoneans, who were priests, and we have here, she's the daughter of the high priest, so we have that echo there. But these priests then became, they took the mantle of monarchy and they became kings. So the Hasmoneans became, they were from the priestly caste, and then they then crowned themselves and became kings. And that's extremely problematic because according to Jewish law, you're not allowed a king must not be a Cohen, must not be one of the priests. A king has to come from the people, and that means that they cannot be a priest. And Daniel Elazar, in his book about Jewish leadership and like the political setup of the Jewish leadership, Jewish polity and power, he makes a point saying that there were three power bases. So you had the prophets, you had the priests, and you had the kings. And the way Jewish leadership had to work was a partnerships between these three different areas of power: the prophets, the kings, and the priests. And it's about how those three work together. And this is reflective of the people's covenantal relationship with God. So there should be a covenantal relationship between the positions of power, but one shouldn't take over the other. And problems happen when one tries to take over the other. So there's a lot of discomfort with that the rabbis have with the priests. I mean, there's this whole split between rabbis and priests anyway, but there's another example of that. There's a problem with that they have with the Hasmoneans. They're saying they take too much power and they became kings. And so there's a kind of tendency to kind of play them down and play down what they were doing. And you kind of have this here of like, well, the armies just fled. They just fled. They just ran away. And that's how the victory happened. So we're going back to this lovely Hanukkah. And so we have this. So far we have, according to like these medieval Jewish legal texts, Judith is a Hanukkah story. It took place, part of Hanukkah story. She's the daughter of a high priest. The king was Greek, was part of the Greek Empire, and that's why. And it goes with the Hanukkah story. But let's have a look at the book of Judith. So here we have. Let's have a look. This is our first piece of art. This is Judith with the head of Holofernes. We're going to be looking at lots of these, but let's have a look at the book of Judith. So the book of Judith is apocryphal, which means it's not part of the Hebrew canon. It's one of the texts that kind of came out, that was kind of associated around, but was not canonized. It is part of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew text. We do see that there, and there is a Latin version which was translated by Jerome, who said that he was translating it from an Aramaic text, but it's uncertain actually what the original language of the book of Judith is. So I am just going to be bringing you an English translation, because there is like a Hebrew text of Judith, but it's hard to know, is this the original? Like, it's definitely not the original Hebrew, because we don't know. So I'm just bringing you the English translation, because also there's a lot of text to go through and for time. So it's a story from it's definitely a story from the Second Temple period. And we know that because it opens talking about the king of Assyria, Nebuchadnezzar, who is threatening this area, the area of Judea where they are. And at one point, and they've threatened and they've attacked various small nations around. And they ask, and he asks about, and these people in Judea are very scared, and they kind of do some sort of fortification, and they sort of get ready. And Nebuchadnezzar asks one of his generals, and it's a general called Achio, who's an Ammonite general. And he asks, well, who are these people? And Achio gives a very potted summary of who these people are that begins with kind of, they went to Egypt during a famine, and Pharaoh enslaved them, and then they became free, and then they built this nation, and then at some point they kind of were overtaken by Babel, and they went into exile, and then they returned. So we know that this is the people who have returned. It's Second Temple period. They have at this point built there is reference to the temple in Jerusalem. So this is the second temple that they're talking about in the book of Judith when they make references to the temple. So it's a second temple story. And the people have really it's quite fledgling though at this point. It says to be composed around 250 to 500 BCE, which is like give or take a couple of hundred. Like that's quite a broad spectrum, but during the Hasmonean period. So go into the text. So the story begins with this Nebuchadnezzar. He's attacked and he's threatening. He's attacked nations around, and he's threatening now this kind of nascent state of Judea. And and the people have sort of are preparing to kind of are under this threat and are scared, and they're preparing themselves. And it has here that they pray to God. And I'll just read this quote. And this is part of the text. So it says, thus every man and the women and the little children and the inhabitants of Jerusalem befell before the temple and cast ashes upon their head and spread out their sackcloth before the face of God. And they put on sackcloth around the altar, and they cried to God of Israel with all constant earnestly, so that he would not so God will not give over their children as prey and their wives for spoil, and the city of their inheritance to destruction, and the sanctuary to profanation and reproach, for the nations to rejoice over them. God heard their prayers and looked upon their afflictions, for the people fasted many days in all Judea and Jerusalem before the sanctuary of the Lord Almighty. And Joachim, the high priest, and all the priests who stood before the Lord and who administered to the Lord had their loins dressed with sackcloth and offered daily burnt offerings with the vows and free gifts of the people, and had ashes on their liturgical headdresses, and they cried to the Lord with all their power, so that God will look upon their house of Israel graciously. So you read this and you kind of go, well, that's what nice from religious Jews do. They're in trouble, they've gathered together, they're crying to God, and God is hearing them. God heard their prayers, and they're fasting, and they're doing what you think they should be doing. And they're under this leadership of the high priest, and because they've come to the temple, so it makes sense that it's the high priest who is leading them at this point. And actually, the text continues saying that they should go and prepare, and they should put watches out to kind of look at the highway of when the invading army may come, and they should prepare themselves, and that they should carry on praying to God, and they should hold fast. Nebuchadnezzar then hears that they're ready for war, and he gets serious and wants to find out, well, who are these people? And he gets told about not just who the people are, but who their God is. And I just want you to notice, one of the things that they're concerned about is actually this defiling of the temple that might happen. So it's very much, they're not just protecting themselves, their people and their children, and the wives, the children, but they're also wanting to protect the temple, that the temple shouldn't be defiled, is one of the things they're concerned about. And so they prepare, and so they go into prepare, and they hear that. So my screen is now the text is a bit obscured. So they hear that that Nebuchadnezzar is actually now becoming much tougher, and is going to invade. And so they now cry, they come to Uzzah. Uzzah is one of the chiefs of the city. So they come to him and they kind of cry, and they want God to judge that. And and say, you've done us great injury, and we've got no helper, and God sold us into their hands, and we're going to be thrown before them with thirst and great destruction. Therefore, you should call them to you, and you should. They're calling for surrender, calling to you and deliver the whole city for a spoil to the people of Holofernes and all his army. By the way, sorry, I forgot to mention, Holofernes is the general of Nebuchadnezzar. He is the general who is taking the lead on this invasion. For it's better for us to be made a spoil for them than to die of thirst. And so our souls may live, will not see the death of our infant for our eyes, or the dying of our wives and children. We present as witnesses to you, heaven and earth, God of our fathers, who punish us according to our sins and sins of fathers. So will not allow what we've described on this day. So the people are calling now to please surrender. We don't want to be invaded. Let's just surrender. We don't not we can, and they're crying. And then Uzzah, this elder, says to them, be courageous. Let's endure 5 days, and in that time God may return mercy to us, and if not, all may forsake us. And if they pass and no help comes to us, I will do according to us. So the leader is saying, okay, just give me 5 days, because there's 5 days, and we'll surrender if God doesn't act. If God doesn't act. And he disperses the people, each to their own posts, and they went back, and they sent the women to children's houses, and they were brought very low in the city. So you can imagine the mood of the city. They are ready to surrender, and Uzzah's saying, okay, 5 more days, just give us 5 more days, and then we'll surrender. So the mood is very low, and it's at this point we have Judith, and where Judith comes into the scene. And here we have this, and before we kind of hear what she does, we've got to hear about her. And so we have here for this story that we have now. At that time, Judith heard about this. She was the daughter of Merari, the son of Ox, the son of Joseph. And we get her lineage now. One of the things I want to point out is, who is she not the daughter of, according to the book of Judith, is that she is not the daughter of the high priest. We know that, that is not her lineage. So already we're seeing this, we have in the kind of that legal text which said Judith, the son of the high priest. But here we have now in the book of Judith, she is not the daughter of the high priest. So we've already got our first, okay, there's something interesting going on. So she's got her lineage here. And Manasseh was her husband of her tribe and kindred, who died during the barley harvest, for he stood to oversee those who bound sheaves in the field, and the heat affected his head, and he fell on his bed, and he died in the city of Bethur, and they buried him with his fathers in the field between Dotham and Balamoth. Here's another thing that I didn't show you the text of it, but there's other places where you have the story of Judith, and actually she's a soldier's wife. She's described as she's a soldier's wife, and she's a widow of a soldier who's been fighting all this time. And here we have no, she's the widow of a farmer. She's not the widow of a soldier, she's the widow of a farmer. Anyway, so Judith was a widow in her house 3 years and 4 months. And she made her tent on the top of the house, and she put sackcloth on her loins, and she wore her widow's clothing. And she fasted all the days of her widowhood, except for fest days, the eves of Sabbaths and Sabbaths, the eves of new moon, and the new moons, and the feasts and solemn days of the house of Israel. So we know that she's a widow, which means that she's one of the vulnerable members of society. And a lot of the Jewish legal texts you have about protecting the orphan and the widow. So she's a widow, so she's a vulnerable, she's vulnerable. But we also have she is not just a widow, she's a widow who is mourning for 3 years and 4 months. And it's that is over and above the usual year of mourning that somebody will do. So she's very serious in her widowingness, and she's also very much about, but she doesn't fast, except she doesn't fast on the festive days, on the Sabbath, on the new moon and everything. So despite her inner emotional anguish at her husband dying, she is still keeping those religious festivals. So we see that actually there's a piety, there's a kind of very strong relationship that she has to Jewish practice. So despite that kind of inner emotional feeling, that she is still quite a religious woman, and that she's doing this kind of Jewish practice of keeping these of the calendar of the festive days. And then finally, we have about her appearance. She also has a graceful temperament and was very beautiful to behold. Her husband Manasseh left her with gold and silver and men servants and maid servants and cattle and lands, and she remained with them. She remained with them, and there was no one who spoke an ill word about her, for she feared God greatly. So now we know about her character, that she's got this graceful temperament. So she's got this, and she's very beautiful. So she's got this sort of, you kind of have this, so this beauty that she has to behold becomes a very important part of the story. But also she's very wealthy, and she has this very large house, or this household, that she's very loyal to, and she keeps, and everyone liked her, and she feared God greatly. She's very pious. So this is kind of this lovely portrait that you have of her, of this very beautiful woman who is very loyal with her. She stays with her maid servants and her men servants, but she's also rich. But everyone likes her. She's not she's not a controversial figure. So she's very graceful. So you kind of get an impression of her that she's just very lovely, very lovely, nice lady. But let's see how she actually acts, because she's just heard this missive go out that people who want to surrender, and she's saying no, and the leader's saying wait 5 days, and if God doesn't do anything, or there's no mercy, then fine, in 5 days if things don't change, then we'll we'll surrender. So that's where this introduction to her, because that seems to be a catalyst. Because what she does then, we've kind of skipped ahead a bit, but what she does then is that she takes off her widow, she takes off her sackcloths, she puts on her jewelry, she puts on her fine clothing, and she goes into the city, and she gathers the elders, and she tells them to come to her, and she goes to them, and she gathers them, and she rebukes them. And she says this, she says, hear me now, you governors of the inhabitants of Bethula, for your words which you spoke before the people this day are not right concerning this oath which you made and pronounced between God and yourselves, and your promise to deliver the city to our enemies, unless within these days the Lord turns to help you. So this isn't a very graceful temperament, like in terms of like she's very like that no one had it, like she seems actually quite tough now. She's kind of like, in terms of like her character. And now she actually puts through her own view of God and how she sees God. And she says, now you have tempted God this day to stand among children of men and stand amongst children of men instead of God. And now test the Lord Almighty. But you don't know anything, for you cannot find the depth of the heart of man, and neither can you perceive the things which he thinks. So how can you search out God who have made all these things and know God's mind or comprehend God's purpose? Like, just like another person is a complete mystery to you and you don't know their inner thoughts, how on earth can you understand God? How on earth can you presume to know God's mind or God or comprehend God? No, my brethren, don't provoke the Lord our God to anger. For if God will not help us within these 5 days, God has the power to defend us when God will, and even every day, or destroy us before his enemies. Do not bind the plans of God, Lord our God, for God is not like man, as if God could be threatened. Neither is God like the Son of Man, so God would be wavering. So she's telling them off and saying, your view of God is wrong, that you've kind of made this code of oath and you're kind of pushing God to help, and if you don't, then we'll surrender. Like, you've got a complete, like, that is not God, and it's not our relationship with God. And then she goes on, I mean, the text continues, I mean, it's a very beautiful text, and the text continues about kind of, when she talks about with them, she says, she basically says, like, we can't give up, and we have to act. And she reminds them that we don't worship, like in the past, God punished the people because they worship idols, and we don't worship idols anymore. But there's something not quite right with the way the people are relating to God. And she said, like, well, that actually the temple is depending on us, people are depending on us, and therefore And she's sort of saying, so don't give up, so she's saying, don't surrender. Her message is don't surrender, like stand fast, don't put God in this position of like only 5 days, like hold fast to your beliefs, hold fast to our way of being, don't push God, don't surrender even in 5 days time. So Ursula, the leader at this point, says to her, well, will you just pray for us? And that because there hasn't been rain and there hasn't been the cisterns have run dry. There's a siege going on, and so they run out of food. And he asks her to pray for them. That's what his request is to her. Well, just pray for us then, please. And she replies, she says, well, I will do something that I will be remembered through the generations. She doesn't say she's going to pray. She says she's going to act. And she says, I'm not going to tell you what it is I'm going to do until it is done. But I'm going to do something that will be remembered. And then she goes away and then she does pray. And here we see a beautiful, it's a very, very long prayer. It's most of chapter 9. And I'm just going to paraphrase it, because actually also my text is a little bit obscured by the pop-up of the thing. So I apologize for that. So she's praying in private, and she's praying, and it's really interesting what she evokes. She says, O Lord God of my father Shimon, whom you gave the sword to take vengeance on strangers, who loosened the girdle of a maid to defile her and uncovered the thigh to her shame, polluted her virginity to her reproach. For you said it will not be so, and yet they did so. So she's praying to the God, not of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. She's praying to the God of Shimon. And who is this Shimon? Who is she praying to? Who's this God of Shimon? And that is the Shimon and Levi, who took vengeance against Shechem, the people in Shechem, for the rape of their sister Dinah. She's evoking a story way back in Bereshit, way back in Genesis, that the Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, is in the text. She goes out. Dinah goes out, and she is there is this attack on the on her by Shechem, and you have Shimon and Levi take vengeance on this by killing that whole all the people that there. And it's something actually that Jacob is very angry about and reproaches them for. And actually that kind of anger and that violence does get there's a lot of reproach for that in the text, in the story of Genesis. So it's really interesting that Judith is evoking that incident, the rape of Dinah. And kind of just like there was vengeance about the rape of Dinah, you're going to help me now. And she goes on in her prayer. She says, God, hear me now, for I am a widow. Give into my hand the hand of the widow, the power that I see. For your power is not found in numbers, or your might in strong men. For you are the God of the afflicted, the help of the oppressed, the upholder of the weak, protector of forlorn, the savior of those who are without hope. I pray to you, I beg you, God of my father, and the God of the inheritance of Israel, Lord God of the heavens, earth, creator of the waters, ruler of every creature, hear my prayer. So the God that she's evoking is the God that is a protector of the weak, a protector of the vulnerable, the protector that Dinah needed, the protector that she feels so her as a widow is that I am vulnerable, I need protection. And that's who she's evoking here. And she's evoking that that she could be successful and to be resolved, that the cruel things against your covenant and your house, so against the temple, and why? So that everyone will know that you are the God of power and might, and there is no one who protects the people of Israel but you. So it's precisely a woman who is seeing herself as weak is coming to do this victory. And the story is turning on that, because God is the God of the protector of the weak, not the protector of the strong, not the kind of not protector of the strong, not the kind of the God of the strong man, but actually God is the protector of the weak women, of that. And so this is part of her prayer. And I find it extraordinarily moving, especially given how tough she was with the elders of like, you don't understand God. Let me, like, you're treating God almost like, like Santa. No, I mean, she didn't say Santa, but like, like if you're good and you pray, then God will listen to what you do and do what you say, and you can hold God to account in that way. And she's like, oh no, but she says, I do know you. I know that you will protect the weak and the vulnerable. So she's calling for God to help her in this mission. So she goes a lot. So this is her prayer, and then she kind of, the text continues that it says that she gets she does anointing, she gets dressed, she puts on lots of makeup, she puts on her beautiful clothes and jewelry, and she goes with her maid and she goes towards the enemy camp. And they take a lot of interest, like, who is she? And she says, I'm going to and when she gets stopped by the soldiers, she says, I want to turn myself in. I've given up on these Judeans. I think I can help you invade them. And there's a fascinating conversation that she had, and she's and take me to Holofernes. Holofernes the general, and she gets brought to Holofernes, and they all, before they do that, they all admire her beauty. They all make a note of, like, the text sort of says, like, she's so beautiful, and like, how can anybody hate a people like this when their women are so beautiful? Like, it's such a weird, but then they say, but we need to do something about the men. Are you kind of like, there's this very strange kind of sexual tension that's being built up here, like, let's get rid of their men if their women look like this, like, right, we'll be well away. And so she kind of, using her beauty, using her sexuality, she gets an audience with Holofernes, and she doesn't just seduce him. This is how she seduces him. So she says that that the God, that the Judean God only protects the people when they are following God, and they are not following God, and she's seen that they're not following God. So she knows that Holofernes will be defeated, will be successful, because they're so sinful. So their sin has overtaken, therefore they'll provoke God to anger when there's no, and the examples that she gives of the people are sinning so much is they talk about the food stores fell, the waters scant, and they've decided to lay their hands on all the holy foods, the things that God has said you can't eat, the first fruits, the tenths of the wine and the oil, the things that were reserved for the priests to serve, all the food that is supposed to go to the temple, the people are now eating. And I've seen this, so I know that you're going to be successful in your victory, and let me help you. And she says, they've sent an envoy to Jerusalem because the people in Jerusalem have done the same, and they bring back word and they will do it. And then you will be, you can destroy them on that day. So therefore I, your handmaid, knowing all this, have fled from their presence, and as God has sent me to work things with you, things which all the earth will be astonished whoever hears it. For your servant is religious and serves the God of heaven day and night. Therefore, my Lord, I remain with you now. Your servant will go out by night into the valley, and I will pray to God, and he will tell me when they have committed their sins, and I will return and reveal it to you. And then you will go forth with your army, and there'll be none among them who will withstand you. So she sets up this situation with Holofernes. She says, like, I am religious, and it's because I'm so religious, and I know that they are not. I will tell you, like, when I get confirmation of that, then I know when they're most vulnerable, because God will remove their protection. So this is the ruse that she has with Holofernes. It's also very clever because it means that she says, I am religious, so I'm going to carry on eating my food, which her maid has brought with this supply of food, and I'm going to go out at night and I'm going to pray. So she's actually with him for about 3 days, and she's doing all of this. So she's not, the attack against Holofernes doesn't happen straight away. It happens after a couple of days of her being with him. And during that time, she set up a routine where she's not eating and drinking their food. And she's eating and drinking the food that the maid has brought along. And she and the maid are actually leaving the camp every night, going to pray, and then coming back and returning. So she's kind of established now a practice of coming and going, of how she's eating, how she's getting by, but she's still there, and she's a very religious woman. And what this is all doing to Holofernes is also building up his lust, because he also sees she's a very beautiful woman. And the text describes that he's going to have his way with her. He's going to set a trap for her. And so he's going to prepare this feast, but he's going to do it with her, with the food, and that it's time now that they should come, that he would do that. And so she comes out and she agrees that she will feast with him. And the text describes that he gets so drunk and he drinks so much wine. It doesn't say that she fed him cheese. It says that he drinks loads of wine. So we don't know if he's drinking lots of wine because he's very thirsty because of the salty cheese, but it does say about the wine. And that actually he drinks, if I remember correctly, he drinks so much in that one day. It's like more than all the wine he's ever drunk since he was a baby. He drank in that day, but that kind of, he's kind of evoking this kind of baby that he kind of falls asleep from the amount of wine that he has to drink. And then we have our big scene. We have the big scene that all this artwork has been created to do. And we have here this big scene that Judith was left alone in the tent with Holofernes, lying by himself on his bed, for he was filled with wine. And Judith had commanded her maid to stand outside her bedroom and wait for her to go forth, as she did daily. She said she'd go forth to prayers, and she told the so she'd set up this scheme that she goes out. So she left, and no one's left in the bedroom, neither little or big, no one there. Then Judith, standing by his bed, said in her heart, O God of all power, look at this time the works of my hand for the exaltation of Jerusalem. For now is the time to help your inheritance, to execute your purposes for the destruction of the enemies who have risen against us. She went to the pillar of the bed, of which was at Holofernes' head, and took down his broadsword from there. And she approached his bed, took hold of the hair of his head, and said, Strengthen me, O God of Israel, this day. And she struck twice his neck with all her might, and she took his head away from him, and she tumbled his body down from the bed, pulled down the canopy from the pillars, and soon after she went out. She gave the head of Holofernes to her maid, and she put it in her bag of meat, and the two went together according to their custom to prayer. When they passed the camp, they encircled the valley and went up to the mountain of Bethula, and it came to its gates. So now she's returned back to the Judeans. She's returned back with the head of Holofernes in the bag. Then Judith said from far off to the watchman of the gate, Open the gate now. God, our God, is with us, to show his power yet in Jerusalem, his forces against the enemy, as he has done to this day. Now, when the men heard her voice, they hurried down to the gate of their city. They called the elders. They ran together, both small and great. And it was surprising that she had returned. And they opened the gate, received them. She'd gone for almost a week at this point. And she made a fire for light, and they stuck around. And then she said to the loud voice, Praise God, I say, for he has not taken away his mercy from the house of Israel, but has destroyed our enemies by my hands this night. And then she takes the head out of the bag and shows it to them and says, Behold the head of Holofernes, the chief captain of the army of Assur, and behold the canopy where he had lain in his drunkenness, and the Lord has struck him by the hand of a woman. And she's like standing there with his head. And it's an incredible scene, and we're going to see it in a minute. But I just want to, at this point, just point out a couple of things, what happens next in the story. So she says, you've got to take this head and hang it on the highest place of your walls. And as the morning appears and the sun shines on the earth, everyone must take his weapons, go forth. And you're going to watch what the Assyrians do, but don't go down. And they will take their arm and they'll go into their camp and call for the captains, and they will run to the tent of Holofernes. They won't find him. Then fear will be, and they will flee before your face. So then you and all who inhabit the coast of Israel will pursue them and overthrow them as they go. But before them do these things. Call Achior the Ammonite to me, so he may see and know him, who despised the house of Israel and sent him to us as if to his death. So a couple of things on this. So first of all, it's let's hang the head up, let's publicize this, but not the walls of Jerusalem. This is a different place. And also the army, the Assyrians will come out and they will flee, but she's telling them, go and kill them, like go and cut them down as they flee. So it's not quite as it was said in that kind of the Jewish legal text I mentioned earlier. But then we've got this character, Achior the Ammonite. Now, he was one of the generals. He was the one who explained to Holofernes and Nebuchadnezzar who these people were, and he with this sort of summary. And he was very mocking and very jeering about the house of Israel and their God, the God of heaven and earth. And he was so she's like, no, get him. I want him to see that I've defeated him, that I've brought down Holofernes. And he comes out, and let's see his reaction. And this is his reaction. He says, when Achior saw had seen all that the God of Israel had done, he believed in God greatly. He circumcised the flesh of his foreskin and was joined to the house of Israel to this day. So he converts. He joins them. He becomes Jewish. He does Brit Milah. And this is where the book of Judith runs into a problem in terms of seeing it as part of the Tanakh. And this is often the reason given as to why the book of Judith is not in the Tanakh. Because what he did, he's an Ammonite. He's not allowed, according to in the Torah, the Moabites and the Ammonites are not allowed to become part of the Jewish people. Ruth was become the kind of get out with Ruth was, well, she's a woman. So you can have a Moabitess, you can have a female Moabite, or you could have a female Ammonite, but you can't have a male. You can't find that loophole with Achior. He's definitely male. He's definitely got a penis because he's just circumcised. You can't get out of that. And so this is often the reason given why the book of Judith doesn't make it into the Tanakh. Because if you do, then it kind of breaks the accepted halachic Jewish legal norms, and it can't be integrated. So there's something, so here we have this Hanukkah story that Jewish legally is problematic. As problematic as the high priests of the priests becoming kings. Also a break with the traditional way in which Jewish law is interpreted. So we have in these stories of Hanukkah, we have this kind of subversion stuff going on. Even though you have Judith, who is we see her as very pious, we see her praying, we see her keeping kosher, see her keeping the Sabbath. There's still something quite like Jewish legally subversive around this book of Judith. And this is where I'll go to start showing it. So here we have this scene. This is from the 16th century. And unlike a lot of the paintings of Judith and Holofernes, we don't have the scene of her decapitating. We don't have that scene in the tent, but rather we've got the scene here now where she's going da-da, and she's displaying the head out, and she's doing it for all the people. And it's I love this painting in lots of ways, mainly because like she's still, for the reaction of the people that are around the sort of state and that she's there in the figure. But you've got here the kind of three, what we're going to look at as three main characters. You've got Judith, you've got the maid, and you've got the Holofernes head that are all kind of tucked up there on the, if you divide this painting into thirds, which you can kind of do with the vertical lines. You've got, by the way, this scene is looking a lot like it's taking place in Venice or some Italian city. But anyway, so you have on the right-hand third of the painting is where you have those three characters, the Judith, the maid, and the head of Holofernes. And the rest of the canvas is taken up with the reaction of the people seeing this head. Another little detail about this painting, I mean, a lot of these paintings aren't exactly that strict about their biblical, like being true to the text. But I like the fact that this painting is also happening at night, because in the text it does sort of describe that she says, stick this head up there because when it becomes morning, they will see it, which means she came back, she walked out with her maid at night. And the text says that she would go out at night to pray. So this, her walking back to Judea, to the city of in Judea with the head in the back. This is all happening at night, and then she reaches out. So you've got the torches, and this is a nighttime scene, which that actually is in the text. So that's quite an interesting thing. Now, what we're going to be doing is, in terms of the drawing, which I would like you to kind of join with me on this, is we're going to be doing a kind of mapping exercise. And we're going to, so I spent a lot of time kind of in the National Gallery, or kind of actually mainly in National Gallery, but sometimes in a few other galleries, like looking at some of the, especially paintings like this, and looking at the complexity of the composition. And I'm looking for kind of like, what is the compositional structure that is going on? And then also what is then the relationships between the different characters within that? And what I'd like to do is just sort of a mapping of that in some of the paintings that we're showing. And I want us to think about the mapping exercise, because what happens with the book of Judith, the story of Hanukkah, is that one kind of gets mapped onto the other. So we want to kind of, the story of Hanukkah, which is the story of like the oppressive external empire is wanting to destroy the people. There's a fear of a temple being defiled. The miracle happened, they go away, and there's a publicity of the miracle. And you've got these elements that are being kind of mapped from one story to the next. So I'm going to do a little bit of a mapping exercise. So what I mean by that is, what I want you to do, if you've got like just take a pencil or a pen, it doesn't really matter. And I want you to kind of going to make a series of rectangles that are roughly the proportions of the rectangles of the painting. So and you don't have to do these very big, you could do them very small. And I want you to select 3 shapes, a circle, a triangle, and a square, and assign them parts. So I'm going to be doing like, the circle is Judith, the triangle will be Holofernes, and the square will be the maid. And that really is, you don't have to think too much about it. It's not important like why one is one shape and one the other. I mean, maybe there could be something very nice about these are like Platonic forms, something about Hanukkah and Greek culture, but we don't have to go that far. So what I want you to do is, like, with those shapes, have a look at what the relationship is in the paintings between these 3 main characters. So you've got the circle, the square, and the triangle. So in this story of Judith and the head of Holofernes, you have here the Judith figure. She's at the top of the canvas, very similar to her height, like much nearer her height, but a little bit further down is the maid. And then right at the very bottom, we have here the head of Holofernes. And this kind of like, you've got this kind of power relationship going on, that she's sort of showing this head, but he's right at the very bottom of this canvas. The other thing to note about this painting is in terms of we know that she's now dressing in like very clothing. Sorry, I think someone hasn't muted themselves because I'm hearing it double. And we have here, and I just want you to also notice like the slight difference in ages between Judith and the maid. So here the maid is depicted as slightly older than Judith. Judith is shown as to being a young woman, a very beautiful young woman in this very luxurious clothing. And here we have this sort of head of Holofernes, this kind of bearded, she's holding him by his hair. That's sort of coming from the text. And then we have, in it sort of going slightly, it's going off the canvas, but you can see the hilt of it. She's holding the hilt of a sword. So the sword will be sort of going upwards, going upwards, going off on the left-hand side. So that's this is one particular portrait. And now we have one which I think probably a lot of people are familiar. This is Caravaggio. So this is Caravaggio. And so if you want to just sort of diagram that one out, and again, see where, like, so his head is actually much more in the center of it. And then you've got Judith and the maid, and their heads are kind of, their bodies are much like they're on the right-hand side. And look at the flow. If you want to sort of also map kind of what's going on with the arms and the direction going on there between, you've got Judith and the maid on the one hand, and then the arms and like that thrust of the sword, and she's holding that sword and the blood is gushing out. You also have this sort of the red canopy there that is echoing the blood that is coming there. By the way, you have in the text, it describes that she doesn't just take his head, she also takes the canopy, the bed canopy that she pulls down. What's very interesting about this painting is that this is around the same time that Caravaggio is being wanted for murder. And he goes on the run quite soon after this painting. So you've kind of got this, like, how realistic this kind of blood spurting out that he's doing here, what he's, you've got all these stories there. I also want you to pay attention to the difference in ages now. Like, so the previous one, the maid and Judith were, like, the maid was a little bit older than Judith, but not much older than Judith. But in Caravaggio, we have a huge difference. We've got Judith, who seems much younger than she was previously depicted in the previous one, and the maid is much older. There's a huge contrast between their ages. And the maid is there holding this sort of fabric. It's like she's holding the bag ready. So she's kind of got that grip. And Judith is holding the sword. So she's gripping the sword and she's pulling. So this is like it's a very kind of gruesome, like with this blood spurting out, coming here with this. But it's, and his contorted body it is around the same. It is kind of taking up pretty much, like, if you divide the canvas in half, you would kind of, he takes up half of the canvas, and these two women are the other half. They're the kind of the double of that. And it's a different balance here with the figures of this particular scene. Now going to turn to Gentileschi, Artemisia Gentileschi, and Artemisia Gentileschi painted this scene. There's 4 different versions of this. This is one of them. And it's a fascinating story. It's quite well known that she was raped, and she when there was a trial about the rape, where she was actually kind of put under duress. I think there was like a torture where a sort of some thread was wrapped around her finger very tightly to kind of pressurize her to make sure she was telling the truth. There is like diary written about it. I think there was in the exhibition on Gentileschi a couple of years ago, in the National Gallery, they went into this, and it said that she used the face of her rapist, was kind of, she used as the model for Holofernes. So this is like kind of very gruesome, like all this blood gushing out. I don't have a close-up of it, but apparently, but if you do, you look up closely, like some of the bead of blood goes up and actually kind of echoes the bracelet that's on her arm. You have like these like dots, these beads of blood there. But you kind of have these 3 in this like very strong triangle with Holofernes at the bottom. You've got, now here you have Judith is at the side. She's not at the top of the painting. And the top of the painting that's the maid, the one in the blue. And you see here now you have a different relationship that's being depicted between Judith and her maid. That actually the maid looks about the same age as Judith, maybe even slightly younger. And like the Caravaggio, a lot of blood spurting out and the contortion of his body, and it's is catching the act of cutting his head off. And it's an act that these two women are doing together, and they're acting together. And there's been sort of very scholarship about like it's Artemisia, the artist, sort of making a point about women working together or women supporting each other. In the text, she sends the maid out, the Book of Judith. It's very clear she's on her own doing this in the text. It's interesting that a lot of paintings of this scene, the maid is there as well. And it's kind of sets up this interesting, like, what is the relationship between these two women? So in this version of it, the two women, they're acting together, and actually the maid is the dominant force here, is like that, is the higher one. I mean, she's holding down, Judith is the one holding the sword, but you feel that the maid is just as involved, just as forceful as Judith. This is another Artemisia Gentileschi's painting. This is one done slightly later. This is from 1625. And here we have, it's after the deed is done, after the head has been cut off and the head has been stuffed into the bag by the maid. And here we now have, like, it's almost like the hierarchy is back with, similar to the first one, with Judith at the top. We then have the maid, and then you have Holofernes. Again, Judith is holding the sword. It's really interesting to see the direction which your eye is being taken in, to kind of, like, she's shielding from the candle, but also the other eye is coming down, forming that very strong diagonal with the knee of the maid coming up, kind of hitting to kind of, and then right directly below Judith's hand holding the sword, you have the head of Holofernes. So it's almost like, yes, this hand holding this sword did that. And Holofernes' head at this point now has this kind of greenish tinge to it, to know, like, definitely dead, definitely a dead head. This head, and although the fact that there isn't any body attached to the head, you kind of presume it's dead as well. But it's that greenish tinge, which is picking up the green of that green velvet cloth on the table. Then you have that red coming through. So this is a very different composition that is showing a very, like, a different scene, but like the scene just further on, but it's sort of like the power relationships between the three. Again, we have a similar relationship of age between Judith and the maid coming there. This is Artemisia Gentileschi's father. And I wanted to show Artemisia's painting first before showing the father. And actually, this is kind of much, like, it's less gruesome. Like, you're not showing that it is putting in the head has been cut off, but it's not green. The head is a kind of flesh colored, it's slightly grayish, but green. But here we have again the maid and Judith. One thing to say about there is it looks like the maid, although we only seen her in profile, she looks like a much younger face than Judith. So she looks younger. Again, Judith is holding the sword. She's still holding a sword. And we have their heads similar heights, very center in the composition of the painting. They're at similar heights, with Holofernes kind of at the sort of lower center of the painting going there. You've got this very interesting diagonal coming near here, like almost like this triangle with the two women's bodies, with Judith's body and the maid's coming up there. Happening on that scene, and that's a similar scene to the previous one of, like, just after the head's been taken off, they're looking for a lookout, when's it time for them to go. This is a later painting. This is again back into the scene of the beheading, and here we have the maid. She's not involved in the action in terms of cutting the head off herself, but she's holding a candle so that Judith gets a good can see properly, and she's holding his arm back. Again, you have the maid and Judith, their heads are around the same height. So they're working together. There's something about that. There's a parity with them, but the maid is depicted as an older woman, much older than she has been in the previous paintings. And Judith here is a younger woman. And Gentileschi, not Gentileschi, and Holofernes is very surprised, like it's just in the act of doing it. By the way, with all these, just to say here, but it also goes to the earlier ones and Caravaggio, etc., is that you don't get a sense from the text that Holofernes wakes up. In the text, it has Holofernes is asleep and he gets his head cut off. Here, he's awake, he's startled, he's shocked, he's surprised. We don't have that in the text, we have that here. So it's like, so really interesting what parts of the text they're bringing, what parts they're kind of, what else they're adding to the story with this interpretation that Holofernes is startled and shocked by this, by what's happening. This is actually a completely, it's very different. This is Rembrandt, Judith at the banquet of Holofernes. So this is before the beheading. Like the story of Esther, the story of Judith has these banquets, these feasts going on. And here we have Judith in her finery, with her furs and her jewelry, and fabulous hair kind of cascading down her shoulders. And her maid is a young girl. It's a big difference in age now. It's a young girl that's holding up this cup of wine for Judith, and then you have in the shadows right at the back, really kind of hidden away, is you have this sort of kind of almost ghostly figure of a man coming through there, of Holofernes. So it's kind of, we know what's going to happen to him. It hasn't happened yet, but he's there. He's sort of shady there in the background. And this is a very different. It's the relationship between Judith and the maid is different, but it's also kind of, it's there. We know what's going to happen in this scene. And now we're back to, and this is straight after the act has happened. We have the body sort of lopping away. You can see the neck, with the blood spurting out. She's holding the head. The head of Holofernes now is almost, you can't see it because of the foreshortening of the arm coming out. And Judith giving us a little kind of sneaky look over the shoulder. You've got the maid there looking at her, kind of, she's kind of probably holding the basket, but you see here Judith holding the sword, and their relationship. So it's almost like the maid and the head of Holofernes are quite hidden, and it's really a portrait of Judith. And it's like she's right in the center. It's really about her and this kind of decapitated body that's sort of flailing around there at the bottom. And I love this painting for its composition and the way it's kind of showing this body kind of with the foreshortening. I think it's really quite, and the kind of the fabric, the way it's like her chemise is sort of falling off her shoulders here, and it's just so delicately painted. You can really get a sense of like how the different textures of these luxurious cloths there. And this is another one. This is probably more closer to what you'd say, like I'll keep saying biblical text, but it's not biblical, it's apocryphal text, to the book of Judith, where you have Judith right center of the frame in the composition. Holofernes kind of, it's almost like you've got this triangle, an inverted triangle this time. You have Holofernes at the bottom, and actually outside peeking through, we have the maid. So the maid is there, but she's not part of the action. She has been sent out of the room, and Judith is like brandishing the sword up above here with this one. And this is finally this one, which is sort of mid 17th century, Baglioni. And here we have Judith, the act is done, Holofernes is there tucked away kind of in the bottom right corner, and her and the maid slightly lower down, again the maid much older, depicted as much older than Judith, and Judith is sort of brandishing sword, holding the sword over her shoulder. And the reason I want to bring this one is that because this one cited as a reference for a much more recent version of Judith and Holofernes. Before I do that, I want to show you this Judith and Holofernes. This is from the Nuremberg Chronicles. It's a 15th century kind of woodcut that pops up, for those of you who, I don't know if you know of it, Printercraft, which is a really interesting small Jewish publishing company that have created a really fascinating Shabbat book called Oneg Shabbat, which has got all sorts of really interesting art and text from different Jewish publications. It's a fascinating one. So they are actually using Judith and Holofernes to be Eshet Chayil. Eshet Chayil is a poem. It comes from the book of Proverbs that is sung on Friday night, often as a kind of seen as praise for the woman of the house, or it's a praise for the Sabbath, who's a queen or who's a woman. But it starts Eshet Chayil, this woman of worth, who can find. And it's translated Eshet Chal is a fierce woman, and they use Judith and Holofernes as the Eshet Chal, as this woman of worth, kind of more than rubies. Her worth is worth more than rubies. And I can't remember how many years ago there was an exhibition in the Barbican of Jewish women artists, and it was called Rubies and Rebels. And the Rubies and Rebels, the rubies bit was from this poem of Eshet Chal, the rubies. And you kind of have, there's something rebellious about Judith here. And I love that the Oneg Shabbat, the Printer Crafts publication chooses her for Eshet Chal. And I wanted to show you that. But this is the painting which that I wanted to show. This is Wiley. Now, this was painted in 2012. Now, he did a portrait of Obama. He's very known for like his paintings, his portraits of Black men, of Black American men also. And this, he's done two versions of the Judith story. And I just want to point something interesting out. So here we have Judith, and we have the head of Holofernes. And if you look closely at this head of Holofernes, it's a white woman. It's actually, he used one of his studio assistants to be the model for this woman, for the head of Holofernes. You don't have the maid here. There is no maid. It's just Judith. You can see that she's holding a sword. And here he's using the story of Judith, of the kind of the weak, the vulnerable, getting her revenge on the person, on the oppressor. And in this one, it is the white woman here on this woman. And it's such an intriguing piece. The woman he used for Judith is actually somebody who, I think the story goes is that he spotted her in a shopping mall in Brooklyn, and she's wearing a sort of contemporary designer dress. So she's wearing a kind of very beautiful, fine, expensive dress, and she's holding the head of a white woman. And we see this with this story of or depictions of Judith and Holofernes, how they become appropriated. So other things get mapped onto it. So this is Klimt loved this story, like painted it twice. Judith and the head of Holofernes. Sometimes it's seen as this is Salome, but it says in the framing, it's very clearly this is Judith and Holofernes. Again, we don't have the maid, and it is mainly Judith, and Holofernes is just sort of just a bit of him is peeking there at the bottom. So she is very full and present, looking down in this gold finery. And his second version, which was painted 8 years later, again, she is it is all about her, and Holofernes is sort of disappearing down there in the bottom with these patterns, and it's a really stunning painting. But I want to show you a more contemporary version of this painting and this sort of story, this relationship of taking the vulnerable to a kind of wish of what they could do to the powerful oppressor. And this is Johanna Schwartzbeck, Judith and Donald, painted in 2019. Johanna Schwartzbeck she was originally Austrian. She was born in 1963, and she came to America in the 1980s. And she does this a lot in her work, that she kind of takes kind of art, known kind of pictures, and then maps onto them kind of political or kind of contemporary kind of resonances of what's going on, her interpretation politically. And this is her version of the Judith story, Judith and Donald. And here you have the blonde Donald. And this was painted in 2019. So, which I think it's a really, it kind of made me laugh, and it also was like quite chilling in some ways as well to her depiction of it. And finally, I think this is the penultimate one I'm showing you. These are two Russian artists showing Judith and Stalin, Judith on the Red Square. And here we have Judith is painted here. She's depicted as the young girl. we don't have the maid anymore. She's gone, but Judith is a young girl in this depiction, and it's clearly by calling it Judith, it's evoking that history of Judith and Holofernes and having Stalin. So you have the vulnerable person, you have the vulnerable in society holding up the decapitated figure of power, and like having defeated him. And so here the idea of Judith as a widow has gone completely, and it's just taking a different turn now by having that on this red square. And it's sort of taking that tradition of Judith and Holofernes and applying it to this other political reality here. And this was painted at the beginning of the 1980s. And just the final portrait of Judith, has to be, the final word has to go to Judy Chicago. And at this point, if you were even continuing to do the diagramming, you need to stop now, because this is really just very symbolic, rather than that kind of figurative thing. So Judy Chicago and her dinner party, this sort of triangular table with various female characters depicted on there, each with their serving plate, with a kind of vaginal kind of depiction in the middle of it. So here we have Judith, and what was there, what remains of the kind of any sort of figurative element of Judith is finally the sword. And pretty much every depiction of Judith, apart from the Judith in the red square, shows Judith holding the sword, holding kind of her power, holding that kind of that weapon, her weapon of choice. And finally, just to kind of finish off, the other huge resonance with this story of Judith, where it goes in, like seduces the man in the tent, and then goes out and goes, here he is, the enemy is now defeated, and echoes back to a much earlier story in the book of Judges. And here the story is the story of not of Jewish one, but of Yael. And Yael, Sisera is the general who is fleeing the battle. He finds refuge in Yael's tent. She gives him milk to drink. So here we now have milk. Here we have a dairy product. She gives him milk to drink, and he goes to sleep. She puts a tent peg in his head, and she kills him. And then Barak, this is the time of Barak and Deborah the prophetess. Barak the general, Deborah the prophetess was leading them. And she shows Barak, and she says, here's your enemy, and here's the head. And they are now defeated. But Sisera was just a general. The king of that time was Yavin, the king of Canaan. Now, this is me. This is not kind of whatever, but it's like here we have another mapping of the Hanukkah story, because you've got the king Yavin. It's very similar to the word Yavan, which is the Hebrew word for Greece. So although this story is way before the temple even stood, it's a much earlier story. You have these kind of threads of like, there are bits of story here and bits of story there that all get mapped onto Hanukkah, onto this story of the oppressor and the vulnerable, and then the weak, fight and powerless, getting their victory over the powerful through a woman who seduces, and then publicizing this miracle. And it's looking for those threads and bringing them together to be able to kind of celebrate the powerless can have victory over the powerful, and that the way to see God is not one who kind of to hold fast with one's faith, and to know that to kind of be able to defend the vulnerable and the oppressed. So that, I'm going to stop share. Can I stop share? There we go. So that is the kind of the way Judith and Hanukkah kind of meet. It's a mapping exercise. It's like something is imposed upon something else to be able to tell the story. It's not a kind of history in the way we normally see it. but it's wanting to bring out these threads and bring out these meanings in order to kind of understand what the drama of the Hanukkah story is all about. So thank you very much for being with me. It was great fun to share this with you. I realize I have gone up to time, so I don't know if there's any time for questions or any comments. Aviva, it's up to you. Over to you. Back to you.
Well, what I'll do is let's do an official end, but then say to people they're very welcome to unmute themselves. And if Jacqueline wants to hang around for a few minutes, I'm sure she'll take any questions, but I am aware of time. So first of all, I want to say a huge thank you because that was a tour de force. It was a tour de force in terms of text, and it was a tour de force in terms of art and also in thinking. And I know there are so many contemporary resonances it brought out for me. For example, looking at the current situation in the Middle East and what should be our reaction to it, and the question of when one endures and prays and when one takes action. I was thinking about the trial of Giselle Pellico and that notion of at what point you make things public and how one stands up to sexual violence. And then I was thinking of a lot of those contemporary artistic depictions of Trump, using those kinds of images. And one of the most famous ones is Der Spiegel, where they had him cutting off the head of the Statue of Liberty. So that a really interesting Klimt reversal. So there is so much that you brought and so much to think about in the present day. You've given us this incredibly rich and salty banquet that I'm sure we're going to take into Hanukkah with us. So first of all, I'm going to invite everyone to just unmute yourselves and give Jacqueline a huge round of applause and thank you.
Brava, brava,
Yeah,
brava.
amazing, amazing. I also just want to say to everyone that this was a kind of slightly early Hanukkah event because when Hanukkah actually starts, it's going to be another festival that day, and also many of us at Limud. But we will be celebrating Hanukkah as Jewish Renaissance. So for the 8 days of Hanukkah, Jewish Renaissance is going to take you around the world in 8 rather than 80 days. So watch your emails because you're going to get a series of emails for every day of Hanukkah, taking you to a different Jewish community around the world. And also to say, I'm going to do my bit of advertising. If anyone's looking for Hanukkah presents to get people, starting from Wednesday evening, the announcement's going to go out with the code to book. We're going to give you discounts on gift subscriptions and for new subscribers, should you want to give JR as a Hanukkah present to any new subscriber. So I hope you'll continue your relationship with JR over Hanukkah and you will take this piece of learning with you. So thank you so much for coming, and a huge thank you again to Jacqueline for an amazing session.
Brava, brava.
Hanukkah Summit.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have to go. I'm so sorry.
No problem at all. Lots and lots of messages in the chat. All these comments about all these Renaissance paintings.
By the way, about that, all these paintings, Judith and the Head of Holofernes is an extremely popular thing to do. I mean, it was selecting the paintings to show you was the choice. Like it is a scene that is painted over and over and over again. It is one of the most depicted parts of the Apocrypha that is there, and it really, I mean, it's got everything really. It's got this like beautiful young woman. You're able to have like a semi-naked man with his head chopped off. What's not to like, really? You get to kind of show off your skills at painting sumptuous fabrics and jewelry. So I understand what you can understand why it's painted quite so much.
Amazing. So people are drifting off, but I can see we've got one question. So if you
Sure.
don't mind, I'm going to add Jo in and we'll take one
Hi,
question
Jo.
and I'll close it. Hi, Jo.
Hi, thank you, Jacqueline. What a fabulous way to make a introduction to Hanukkah for the season. I've
Thank
never
you.
had a better prelude to Hanukkah than tonight. And I loved the interaction where we could do the drawing and the mapping and so on. But here's my question.
Sure.
You mentioned in the Judith story that at one point there were three classes of people. There were the prophets, there were the priests, there were the
Ah,
kings. And since the story takes place with Greek characters in Greece, is there a relationship to democracy? So, for example, as we watch what's happening in the modern world, Aviva mentioned the the in my mind the horrors of Donald Trump. Is that part of the story that this balance, you've got to get the balance right between the priest, the prophet, and the king, or society unravels? What
yeah.
are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so the comment about the priests, prophets, and kings, that's really a First Temple problem, Sip, that you have these three power bases and that power gets kind of jostled between them. And in the ideal setup is when you have the king and the prophet and the priests all kind of holding each other in checks and balances. And you also have the people as well, and you often see them sort of represented by like the generals or the army, and you have the people as well. And Daniel El-Azhar, this is this book, Jewish Polity and Power, which goes into kind of the political structure of the Jewish people. And in biblical, in like this is really looking at the Book of Kings, which is earlier than the Judith story. So there he talks about the fact that the people have a covenantal relationship with God, which was like that's the Torah, that the people are in partnership with God, and therefore all the leadership structures have to reflect a partnership. And so they have to hold each other in checks and balances. I don't think you could call it democracy in the way that we understand it in terms of the representation of the people, or like one person, one vote, like however you define democracy. I think it's much more about there's a system of checks and balances on leadership. And that's how, when the people act, that's the success of the people is like all of these leadership structures are supposed to be there in order to make the people have a positive relationship with God, but also with each other in terms of the moral and ethical standards of the day. And you see it in the Book of Kings a lot, where you like actually the Book of Samuel, like when King David sins, it's the prophet Nathan who pops up and tells him off. And there you see like quite a good use of that. In the Book of Kings, you see the high priest also is a kind of bit of a check and balance when something's gone very wrong with the kingship, with the throne, in a much later story. So you see this kind of grow. I don't know if it's democracy, but I think it is definitely indicating that there are ways in which to establish society so that power isn't concentrated all in one place, where corruption, therefore inviting corruption. And that was for a lot of the rabbinic, especially the kind of like in the rabbinic period, the criticism of the Hasmoneans, that whilst they started off as high priests and they were saving the temple from being defiled and they were wanting to protect the people in their relationship with God, they took too much power for themselves and they became kings, and then corruption became rife. So there is a concern about not necessarily about democracy in the way we would understand it, but I think more that power, and I think the story about Judith is all about this kind of the powerless becoming the victor, but actually about not becoming, about a rejection of the powerful.
And in America, you have three branches of government. You have the Congress, you have the judicial, and you have the executive. And I just wonder if the authors of the Constitution, when they created that, might have taken some wisdom from one of the greatest women who ever lived, Judith. And we could give Judith the credit for creating this wonderful balance.
Well, it wasn't Judith. I mean, that prophet, priests, and kings was there in the first temple period. Actually, by this point, there aren't that many prophets. Prophecy has kind of gone from the people, and it's really just the kind of the balance between the priests and the kings. So
Good, thank you.
Amazing question. Thank you so much, Joe. Just to I'm going to do a little plug for a Jewish Renaissance Jewish Book Week session now, because you were joking, but I'm taking this for a factual response. So Thomas Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence said we hold these truths to be sacred. And actually the other founding fathers, including Benjamin Franklin, challenged it until it became self-evident, because they were worried about imposing a religiosity on it. So that wording changed, but actually Jefferson's intention originally was about a kind of religious notion of truth. And the reason I'm saying that now is because I learned that partly from reading Andrew Paul Ancher and his book on Theodore Roosevelt called American Maccabee. So we've got a little Hanukkah tie-in. It's going to be one of the Jewish Renaissance sessions at Jewish Book Week this year. So we can ask all those questions about Andrew when we do American Maccabee at Jewish Book Week. Anyway, I'm going to say thank you. Thank you all for sticking with us so long. We are way over time, but I think it's been a brilliant session, and Hanukkah Sameach, everybody.
And bring Jacqueline back again. She's brilliant.
We will do.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Thank you.